Good evening, everyone. It is July 22nd. Going to do a map update because I haven't done one in a while. A lot of the battlefield has been somewhat stagnant up until about 7 to 10 days ago when the Russians started conducting more offensive operations. And that's what I want to talk about here. And I'm using the Institute for the Study of War map rather than Deep State or some of the other maps that I've used before for a specific reason. It shows the colors where Russia has confirmed gains, where Russia has gains that they are claiming, and then it also has the Ukrainian gains that they had over the last few months and such. So kind of zooming in, and I'll point you, kind of orient you to the colors here. And a good point to start with is Bakhmut because it shows all three colors really, well, four colors. Obviously this kind of opaque red is the Russian territory they gained in the initial invasion. Anything that is in dark red is new Russian territory. Anything in blue is Ukrainian territory they've regained. And anything in this kind of orangish yellow color is claimed Russian gains. And so basically Russian mill bloggers or Russian Telegram channels have shown images that Russian troops have pushed into these areas, but also they may not have stayed there. It may just have been an assault and then a pullback. But what this orange tells us is where Russia is conducting attacks. And one thing that is very interesting is for the first time in a long time, we're seeing many attacks across the entire line of contact on this entire battlefield. So kind of starting, I'll zoom us back out and start us up north where Russia has been attempting to push towards Kupiansk. And you can see anything that's in orange, again, is Russian claimed territory. But often what you realize is this territory has had Russians on it at one point. So you can see there's been broad attacks to try to get to Kupiansk. The problem is this is an uphill terrain from these rivers, and they have these rivers to cross, and that's quite difficult to do for the Russian military. And again, the Russians are still using their kind of human wave tactics here in a lot of these places. And Ukraine has had to go into a defensive posture. And the reason they have is because they're anticipating a reduction in support from Western countries. From what it looks like with the continuing resolution that comes out of Congress, there's not going to be a discussion or even a meaningful effort to try to get Ukraine new funding until possibly March. Now, I hope that to be not the case, but I'm not holding my breath at this point. So what we're seeing is Russia go on the offensive quite hard across the entire front line in order to try to elicit some gains while they have a bit of initiative as the Western powers that have been supporting Ukraine have been waffling about continued support, unfortunately. And for the record, it is absolutely a bad idea for the United States to support Ukraine for 2 years and then just shut off the support. That shows a lack of commitment. It shows that the United States is weaker on the global stage, and we really can't be projecting that type of message that we will support you for a bit, but then we won't see it through with you. That's just me editorializing. So let's just go back to what we're looking at on the entire battlefield here. So zooming out, you can basically see that from the Kupiansk line all the way down to Lyman, there's some sort of battles taking place. Now, this is confirmed Russian gains recently. These are all areas where Russia has pushed in at least and potentially have stayed, or they've just been there and with enough imagery to show that Russia was there, and then they have been beaten back. Again, all of this yellow doesn't necessarily mean Russia is there. It just means that at one point Russia pushed their line of contact that far forward and then potentially had to retreat because Ukraine is quite strong across the entire front line at this point as well. But Ukraine is having to change tactics. They're having to somewhat bend, don't break, conserve ammunition, conserve equipment to try to wait out Russia. They can give some ground because, as you can see, when we zoom out here, they have a lot of ground they can give. They don't want to give it, but they can trade land for lives, and they can attrit Russian forces and equipment while in somewhat of a defensive posture. And I will probably do another video here either later tonight or early tomorrow that discusses why this defense is not sustainable either. And I don't like the idea that the United States is trying to push Ukraine into a defense for the short and midterm in order to try to bolster a potential long-term push later next year or something like that. So looking across the battlefield again, across the whole thing. You can kind of go down to Bakhmut. You can see some of the gains that Ukraine had when I talked about them in Bakhmut, south of Bakhmut. But now you can kind of see Russia regaining territory here. And these aren't large swaths of territory. I'm not talking about hundreds of kilometers. These are just a few kilometers across the entire line. And again, Russia is losing thousands of troops every week trying to take this territory. But that's a tactic they're happy to continue. So when you see this blue, Ukraine took that back. But you see, Russia is attacking. Russia's attacking heavily across the line of contact here, trying to secure Bakhmut supply lines and other ground lines of communication so that the Russians can reallocate troops to other regions. Now, one of the areas that has been a big focus since summer for like 6-7 months now is Avdiivka. And you can see where we've talked about how Russia's dumping a lot of troops in this region. And you can see they've been pushing in hard. They're trying to double pincher move. It's a double envelopment, basically, is what they're trying to do. And take Avdiivka from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians continue to fight here. And it's not necessarily because Avdiivka is extraordinarily important from a strategic standpoint for the Ukrainians, but it's the place where they are willing to meet the Russians and kill the most. Basically, this is a meat grinder for the Russians, and the Ukrainians are happy to oblige here. Again, this is one of those situations where they will trade a small amount of territory every week for thousands of lives and hundreds of pieces of equipment. So that's kind of what Avdiivka is looking like. If this continues, though, the amount of combat power that the Russians can bring to bear here over time could potentially overwhelm the Ukrainians, and we could see Avdiivka fall. Therefore, Ukraine would have to fall back to a further back point or higher ground and continue the whole cycle over again in the next city. Thousands of Russian lives, hundreds of pieces of equipment, just to gain some strategically, generally insignificant pieces of ground here. Now, as we kind of slowly move the battlefield, you can just see all of these places in kind of orange where Russia is pushing. And like I said, Russia is taking this opportunity. They're taking advantage of the situation where the West has waffled on its support, and now they're trying to drive a knife in the heart of Ukraine. It's not going to be very successful because they just don't have enough troops and equipment to do this across the whole battlefield. And the Ukrainians are fighting in their own home, and they do still have enough equipment to hold off the Russians. But the question is, for how long? You get down into some of the other areas. This was the area where Ukraine was from Orikhiv pushing southward to Tokmak. That was originally the plan, was to try to get to Tokmak to disrupt the logistics lines across the entire battlefield for the Russians. Ukraine was unsuccessful in doing that. Again, they just weren't provided enough equipment in enough time to do that. So continued issues where they're just not getting the support they need to drive Russia out. And it's worth noting that at the beginning of this, Russia was probably a top 5 military power on paper. It's not like all that combat power went away. It's just that they didn't use it very effectively. And now, because they don't have that combat power, they're just throwing people at the problem. Well, people still can take ground. It's just not taking very much ground. And when you zoom out in the total picture here, it's very little. It's very little relative to what they gained initially in the first stages with their actual trained forces. And then we come over here to Kherson, where we see where the Ukrainians established a pretty strong bridgehead, which they still have here, but the Russians are definitely counterattacking. And so what we're seeing is a give and take along this area here, along the Dnieper River, to try to hold this bridgehead for Ukraine while Russians are trying to drive them off. And that's where we're at right now. We need to get Ukraine equipment from the US, from Europe. That way they can continue to push Russia out. If they don't get that, we could see a pretty long protracted defense and possibly even a stalemate. However, it is worth noting that Russia has the advantage in any kind of stalemate because over time, Russia can ramp up its industrial power. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians don't have that same capability just purely from a funding standpoint. Russia is a bigger country with more people, bigger military industrial complex than Ukraine has. So Ukraine absolutely relies on the West. And therefore, if no more support comes, Russia can eventually start to chip away and overwhelm the Ukrainians.